A little bit loud. Good morning, everyone. Some great keynotes so far this morning. So this is the technology track. We have a panel discussions today on enabling digital innovation using open infrastructure platforms. We've got three great panelists. So on my right, we've got Jamie Beckland. Jamie is Vice President Marketing at Janrain. Jamie brings over 10 years of diverse experience with an extensive background centered around connecting new digital capabilities and communities. In the middle, we have James Brown. James is a solutions engineer at Google. He brings over 15 years of experience in software development and server management. He's currently a solutions engineer at Google, assisting external companies move towards workload to the Google Cloud platform. And the far right, we've got Austin Winters. Austin is a practice director, digital strategy at Acquia. Austin is a modern marketer with a passion for using digital to create great customer experiences, cross-channel and device. All great marketing starts with customer centricity, personalized conversation with the perfect content at the perfect time on the right device. So how it's going to work, we have three questions that we're going to ask the panel. There's going to be some discussions, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&As. So gentlemen, first questions, what are some of the use cases you've seen that leverages open infrastructure platform to innovate? So can you talk about some of the customers that are using open infrastructure to generate some great innovations?
Sure, I'll start. Wow, these mics are loud. Now they're not as loud. Had to. So I want to actually start by talking about the Mississippi River Delta, because I just went to Houston and I, did some reading about it, and I think it actually is a good analogy for how I think about open technology and open infrastructure. And the Delta is like 100 million years old, and the sort of the path that the river takes deposits 20 billion tons of sediment and rock into the delta every year. So you have this huge sort of eons of sort of building layers upon layers, and then you have sort of plants growing up and dying and creating part of the new layer, and then you have dinosaurs and then dying and then creating dinosaur bones that get covered over and that eventually sort of sink down, and over time those dinosaur bones turn into oil, and then the oil gets pumped up, and then that creates an economy, and then you have new sort of animals sort of entering that ecosystem. Like bears. I had no idea that Louisiana even had bears. And that is actually what I think is happening with open technology today, which is that the level of openness has started like on raw hardware, right? That's what we were dealing with. I mean, obviously not 100 million years ago, but you think about it. Yeah, exactly. In maybe a 10-year or 15-year time frame. But so what we've done is we sort of build openness on top of hardware, and then incrementally over time, we've added layers of additional functionality that build up the stack and build openness and flexibility on top of sort of the previous generations of sediment. And so I think, any conversation that we have right now is going to be sort of capturing a moment in time of where open technology is best applied in this moment. But also, I think we can expect that will continue to change moving forward. So with that context, I'll just take a snapshot of what's happening, I think, right now in November of 2015. So I'm seeing a lot of interest around sort of refactoring or restructuring services that were originally deployed in 2009, 10, 11 timeframe, when you were building on a much lower part of the stack. Maybe you were building on raw hardware. And at this point, those microservices and those layers of sediment have accumulated enough that you really have to you have to sort of refactor and move up the stack and bring that openness up a level. And so I see a lot of organizations working through that process right now. And there's different levels of maturity there. But I think what that's reflective of is this idea that the business value that you can add as a company is moving up the stack too, and this whole movement of IT as a service sort of leads into that. So I see a lot of work right now on sort of restructuring of platform architecture, which maybe seems like it's far away from a specific business problem, but it's foundational work, right? That we need to do for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so again, I'm James from Google, and I totally agree with everything that you're saying on that. And to try to kind of bring that around for what Google's actually providing is we are trying to be that platform that you're able to build on top of. And by doing that, we're offering open APIs, we're offering things like Kubernetes that we're actually giving back to the community. That's technology that Google wrote internally. We used internally for 10 years and then opened up so that other people could start using those services to build microservices, and then even layer on top of that and use the technology to use the platform rather than having to worry about, is this server on, or how much bandwidth do I need to provision, or worry about the fine details of an application or a program that you're writing, and worry about the actual business case and the business use, and worry about things like marketing and things that you do best, and not have to worry about that. And I know that's where we're really trying to focus on and really try to help is to create that bottom layer so that you don't have to, so that you can do what's more exciting and do, nobody wants to worry about servers that are running and plugging in Ethernet cables. They want to be able to solve the business problems that they're best at. And that's really where we're taking a stance in both in cloud and in the community with things, and supporting events like this to try to just help people understand that and show that where we can help really enable you to do what you do best.
I think that kind of building on that, I have a little bit of a different perspective. We've spent the better part of the last decade claiming to be focused on sort of experience-centric design, or claiming to be focused on customer centricity when it comes to product, or how we think about great experience design companies, and using that at the heart of kind of how they go to market. And what we've seen is 10 years ago, that meant, yes, I'm getting a Flash website. And then like 5 years ago, that meant, wait, we need to know who our customers are. How do we just say, hello, I am? And now when we look at what that really means, it's at the core of the business. Whether you're a grocer who's been in a legacy business for a long time, looking at how the landscape has shifted from, well, if I want something now, I can basically call Uber and get something delivered. If I want my groceries, I call Amazon Fresh. And if I'm looking for a meal, I can use Blue Apron. Suddenly the ecosystem has shifted, and what that has meant is companies are going through transformation, and wait, I'm not a grocer, I'm now a technology company. And so what's happened along that evolution is we've also seen the technical landscape shift from purely being, well, I'm going to go all in on the Microsoft stack, or all in on basically a proprietary stack, and that makes my development lifecycle shorter, that makes the perception of the value I give back to the business faster. But what's also happened is the channels of which consumers choose to engage has become increasingly complex. And as I look at it from purely a solution architecture standpoint, looking at basically the open stack and how you can build on things like Drupal or on top of the Google Cloud, and thinking about how they make things portable or how you bring that together, open source basically gives you that channel. So at Acquia, I'm responsible for a digital practice that's focused on Drupal, which is a web content management system. And everyone thinks, oh, we've talked about web content management for so long now. But what's interesting is the use case is changing. Like, we're working with clients who have millions of installs on their native iOS and Android application, and they're now looking at, how do I manage content cross-channel? So it's not even about making the investment in the core website. It's about shifting that investment for how content lands across each channel. And so as you think about what that means, you start to look at your marketing stack, and you have things like, well, what am I going to do from nurture? What am I going to do from web content management? What am I going to do from presentation? What am I going to do from CRM? And like, suddenly you're looking at, I actually don't want to be locked into a single stack. I actually want to be able to have the flexibility to use multiple clouds or multiple products. And so for me, like as I think about that question, it's the openness of choosing what's best to reach the customer and how you reach them. And so that's sort of the seat change that's happened as I look at it.
So you mentioned grocery, and I think that's actually a really interesting sort of moment, because it's a very hot space in VC. It's very hot, here in town. I don't know if anybody actually goes to the grocery store anymore, so I work with Janrain, and we manage customer identity, and the CPG and grocery world is a really interesting kind of microcosm of this idea of sort of moving up the stack. So loyalty programs obviously have been huge in that sector for a long time, and so you have millions, tens of millions of users with loyalty program information, with SKU level information about what they've been buying. And travel and hospitality has it too. They know what kind of pillow you like and where you like to be relative to the elevator and all this kind of stuff. But that's been sort of isolated and siloed in a system that was purpose built for managing this loyalty program. And there's a bunch of rules, and it's very specific, right? And so now what we're starting to see is as that blending of moving from the loyalty program into e-commerce, into grocery delivery, into some of these other use cases, that you need to turn some layers of that program into services, right? So you're turning that identity, in our case, that identity around who that user is, from just applicable to the loyalty program to applicable now to all these other touch points in the customer journey. So, it sort of creates, you talked about layers of sediments and that stratification of the stack, but it also creates sort of a blurring or a reconsideration of those horizontal, application layers too.
I think identity is going to be one of the keys to how we think about doing that. That loyalty programs, as we know them, if we think about like the most coveted segment at the moment of professional millennial, like loyalty programs aren't, I want a card and I'm going to go to the grocery store and use my card. Loyalty programs are now predicated on, I want you to know who I am and what my preferences are, both based on implicit and explicit attributes. And so I think identity is a good way to start thinking about the next change that's going to come. No more can I give you a card and you're going to tell me everything about you in exchange. Like the relationship has moved past that. And so I think that's a great kind of perspective of how identity becomes one of the ways to bridge that.
We actually have a real good use case for that. We have a customer, Zulily. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, where they do online sales, a lot of what they call flash sales. They'll get something in and sell it out real fast. And they were in the exact use case where you were saying, where they had all this siloed data and they didn't know who was buying what or who did what or anything like that. And they used some of the open source technology that we support, but it's still open, that they were able to get that data out. And now people all across the company, not just people in tech, they're buyers that are using this technology to be able to determine what people might buy based on what they have bought and what other people have bought. And they're making these real-time decisions using that data rather than it all being locked up in an IT department that nobody can get to or use. It's really enabling those people to do their job, even though they're not technically in technology, but they're using the tech and the data to make those decisions. And Zulily's they have like I think 5 million customers, and half of them buy online, and so it's all tied into even the mobile aspect of it. And they've really grown exponentially because of that, being able to use that data themselves.
So let's say I'm a CDO of a company, using proprietary technologies. I want to jump in the open source, open platform, really don't know what to do, where to go, where to start. What should I be aware of? And do you guys have any tips and tricks as to, all right, I'm ready to jump in, I've done my study, where should I start if I want to start using open infrastructure technologies?
I would venture to say that working backwards, when it comes to project delivery, there isn't a lot of difference. Like once you've made your technical decision and once you've basically put your plan in place, whether it's proprietary or open source, it's the same delivery methodology. Where we guide kind of our clients is, starting with understanding the legal and regulatory environment, and a lot of times it's providing education to your in-house legal counsel and providing education to procurement about that open source isn't something to be scared of, and it's not something that's the wild, wild west, that there's licensing and indemnification, and there's the normal things that you would see in commercial software. The next is much more interesting to me. It's about basically organizational use case and placement. So for example, in Drupal, one of the things that the association that runs the open source project has enabled is basically attribution at a company level, a developer level, and a project level. So as an organization, if you're going to embrace Drupal, do you want to have your community contribution noted? So every time you make a module update, do you want to say, these are all of the updates that Pfizer has made back to the community? I personally think that it's really important, both from a corporate PR strategy as well as a recruitment strategy, that if you're going to bet on open source, you should be an active participant and a visible participant in the community. The second is really around enabling your developers. That as you think about attracting talent in kind of an open source environment, it's different. That not that developers on proprietary stacks don't share. I mean, Stack Overflow, and I can name dozens of wildly popular sites, but knowing that your talent profile is someone who joined the community from a contribution standpoint, like locking them and saying, oh, everything you work on you can't share or talk about, is going to limit the kind of talent that you're able to attract and retain. And then it's developing that cultural shift inside the organization that, hey, there is some great modules, it is faster time to market, but we also need to go through our diligence each time we do module selection or component selection, instead of just putting it in the stack. And I'm sure you guys have more to kind of add on and how you've thought about it in either your orgs or with your customers.
Yeah, I both at Google and other companies that in the area and really in the industry, we see a lot of them giving back and benefiting from that. If you're trying to move into that, you don't necessarily need to jump right in and feel like you need to contribute back, even though we certainly encourage it. But we do find that a lot of companies are able to hire and find people because of what they're opening up to the community. Facebook's a great example of that. They actually do presentations on frameworks before they're even available to get people excited about it and developers excited, and then they go look and see who's using it and hire from that. And it's a great way to do that, to find developers and find people that otherwise you might not have access to. But again, if you're trying to shift in, don't feel like that's a requirement, because that could, both legal and just the manpower to do that if you're a smaller organization. We certainly want that to happen, but I think you're better off just looking at the technology and seeing which one fits your use case, and either future development or pieces of what you currently have, and shift those over first, and do it incrementally. You don't have to flip the switch on everything and move from closed source to open source overnight. You can do it definitely in pieces.
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind for me. The first is, one of the hats that I wear is on the product side of our business. And when we look at the right way to solve problems for our business from a technology standpoint, obviously we, as much as we can and as much as it makes sense, we always look at open solutions. And one of the criteria for us when considering those solutions is what is the vibrancy of the community around that solution, right? I mean, sure. We're sort of tiptoeing into it, but I think it's worth making that point explicit, because from a talent perspective, from a sort of pace of innovation perspective, right? Like those are that it's material, right? It has a material impact on how fast you're going to be able to move, and how what the sort of foundation of the move, the shift that you're thinking about making is. I mean, it's a different model, right? It's a more fluid and flexible model than saying, look, I know that I can find certified developers, that have gone through this like rigorous orientation program, and it takes a different kind of recruiting, right? You probably have to work with your management team and HR and sort of what that right profile looks like and how to build it. But it ends up, I mean, so you sort of want to have that community there, and you want to be able to see it, and you want it to be visible. Go to the events, go to the local meetups, go to the national, international conferences to validate that, right? Because it's important that it's actually real. But which is all in support of what we're all trying to get to, which is the ability to move faster, right? So that community is a direct reflection of how fast you're going to be able to move your own business forward. So when you think about sort of what's the case to be made from a business strategy perspective, it's as much about being able to preserve existing competitive advantage and continue to build new competitive advantage as it is about sort of managing, costs and managing, sort of the traditional sort of ways that we think about IT infrastructure and talent. And so I think that, in this sort of seismic shift that this decade I think is really about, is sort of moving IT from a cost center to more of a business partner kind of perspective at the executive level. I mean, it's a very fundamental and foundational shift that, sort of at the top level, leadership should be thinking about, where does technology accelerate us? Where do they help us innovate?
Good, excellent. So from your perspective, who are some of the organizations that you've seen, that have done, this really well, moving towards, open source platform? And in your opinion, why is that they were so successful to doing it? Any example, like one company, good use case, you see, wow, these guys really successful in bringing innovation, bringing out new products using open platform?
So I have a great example. We, without sounding too salesy, we have an app offering called App Engine, where you can take your PHP or Golang or any Java, your applications, and deploy them on our hot platform. You don't have to worry about servers or load balancers or bandwidth or provisioning or anything like that. You deploy it. And two gentlemen from Stanford University decided to use that to deploy an application that grew wildly popular and became Snapchat. And it runs entirely on the platform. They send like 700 million photos and videos a day through that. It's just astronomical, the amount of data that is sent through the application. And it even registers on percentage points on the amount of bandwidth of the whole internet. They send so much. So being able to utilize a platform like that using open source technology and deploying onto it is really a great way. They were able just to deploy. And like I said, I don't want to sound too salesy, but it really enabled them to not have to worry about anything except writing code, developing new features. They deploy like 5 or 6 times a day, just bug fixes or new features. It really allows them to just build, and that's all they really want to do. They don't have to worry about buying servers and setting them up and racking them in racks in some data center. They focus on their business and what they do best, and I think that's really helped them innovate and move very quickly, because that's all they're doing is just deploying, and they still maintain a pretty small team relative to other startups of that size. And by using those open source technologies, it really enabled them just to come to market so fast. And though your company may not be Snapchat size, you certainly can do the same thing using those same technologies.
I have kind of 2 use cases that actually build on this same kind of concept. One is a big multinational CPG that we work with, and they've made a beyond multi-million-dollar investment into a core web content management. And they've standardized and consolidated, which is great. But as they now are being pushed for other use cases of how do I land content in my native apps? How do I manage content that needs to go through 2 levels of review from legal and cultural translation? How do I think about a syndication model where I'm not even sure where the channel is the content will wind up, but I want to control how it winds up there? And so when they looked at basically their core stack, they realized that the investment level was going to be too high and too slow. And so what they did is they turned to looking at basically what's the open source alternative. And I would say it had nothing to do with their passion and interest for open source. It was all about what fit within their solution architecture and information architecture. And what was interesting is their current solution, they could actually achieve it, but it was achieved after about a year, and who knows how much in terms of licensing. And when they looked at an open source alternative, they were able to say, well, wait a second, like I actually know that I want to keep this part of my solution in place. I don't actually want to change my applications. They're being fed through, say, an S3 bucket on Amazon. What I really want to focus on is what's the content workflow to more effectively land content for staging in a mobile application. And so that's a very kind of non-traditional use case when you think about the big players in the CMS space who are all about, well, let's build the best digital experiences. In this case, it was let's build the best content to land in an existing experience. The other kind of example follows that same vein, which is it's a kind of large travel and hospitality company who's trying to build a better way to manage basically customer relationships. And so their kind of endpoints for how they think about, they have agents if you call in, they have a website that if you go to and look for help and FAQ, they have a mobile application, and then they basically want to create a culture where the agents can curate their own story of how they use the content to help enable a better customer experience, and then share that content basically across the organization. I can assure you that's not a standard CMS use case, but when you think about the roles of open source and you break, that's about workflow, it's about content management, and it's about basically connection to internal systems. Suddenly a use case like that's actually achievable in the CMS space by looking at open source. And so I think both of those conversations neither started with a preference for, hey, I want to use open source just because it's open source. It's, hey, I'm severely limited by budget or licensing or timelines from what I can do from an innovation standpoint. And so they turn to looking at Drupal as that kind of alternative. And so it really is about best fit, which is something that I don't think you can always say with a straight face when you're looking at proprietary investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that I think everyone at this in this day is thinking about is sort of this shift that I think Appnovation is doing a great job at articulating from this sort of historical concept around open source as a concept, right, to a more consideration of what are open technologies and what do they do and what do they provide and how do you categorize them differently, right? So, you know, one thing I would say is when you're thinking about open technologies, one of the things that should be important, or that I think ends up becoming important, is your ability to use the technology at any level of abstraction. So, you're thinking about technologies that are built from like the API layer up, right? So that you can go all the way down to the API layer and build whatever you want on top of it, or you could interact with, some, minimal subset of, application that is pre-built, or, you could use an entire stack that's designed to accomplish a concrete solution. And so you get to decide sort of what level you want to interact with the platforms on. And so, when I think about sort of companies that are doing this in a really interesting and impressive and useful way, I think a lot about Pfizer, which is a client of ours. I know it's somebody that probably many of these people in this room know and are aware of. One of their challenges is providing different levels of access into the platform for different users, for different business units, for different roles, for different partner relationships, and then being able to sort of centrally manage, who has access to what in a really sort of specific way, really. And what that's designed to do is to give the right people in the business the right capability and flexibility to get their job done in the best way possible, while still sort of centrally having some level of control and visibility about what's happening within the technology itself. Because ultimately, IS lives in IT. All of these sort of privacy, security, regulatory, governance, compliance, all of that lives within the technologist universe. And so, while enabling the business, you can't give up too much control. And with the consumerization of IT, that's what we see so much, is that the business just goes around you. And instead, what we're trying to do is say, look, we'll give you that functionality, we'll give you the flexibility you need, but we want to do it with technologies that we understand, and so we still have visibility into what you're doing.
I think it is is about choice and open architecture. It's a really interesting to think about it from the API up. Like that's the core of what we're talking about, is that the more open the technology is, the sort of less restrictions you're going to have 3 years from now when there's a new use case. And that connects right back with vibrancy of community. That if I were to look, like how active is the community in terms of contribution? I mean, you're basically making a strategic bet on a community over a company. And so you have to do your diligence the same way you would on the commercial software side of, are they going to innovate? Are they going to be around? You need to look at it from a community standpoint to make sure that as the use cases evolve and the desired experiences evolve, like, is the scenario that we're not talking about of, oh, I'm going to use an API connection here, going to serve whatever that future use case is? And so I think that actually was a great answer that starts to tie some of that together.
Yeah, for sure.
At Google, how do you guys think about if you're doing something within the business and then you think about sort of, should this be part of a broader community or is this something that's ours? How do you weigh that?
Yeah, so Google's been real good about doing things like that. Things like BigQuery MapReduce is a good example. We built it internally, we used it for years and years, and ended up writing scientific white papers on it, which became Apache, Hadoop, and HBase, and that whole product suite. So we constantly are trying to take technologies that we use internally, productize them, and deploy them externally, and then on the cloud we offer them as services, where if you don't want to run it yourself, we'll run it for you and use the whole Google infrastructure that you can. Kubernetes is a great example with a lot of people are looking at containers right now, and that's a great use case where we support it and we help run it, but they had 400 contributors in the last, I think, month. And so the community's real vibrant about it, but there's also that guidance from a company that's investing in it. So where we can, we try to externalize and productize and release things like that to help the open source. But we also try to get community involvement so that even, not that we're not supporting them, but even if we didn't, the community's still driving where that technology is going.
Yeah, I'll make one other point, actually, because as I'm thinking through this, one other thing that I think it's important to look for is look, this is not a feel-good exercise, and it's not an academic exercise, because you just mentioned academics, although it's research, so totally different. But I guess my point is, you should expect and you should look for companies using this technology as their primary focus that are successful. I mean, somebody should be making money on the technology. If nobody's making money on the technology, then that's one of those indicators of the vibrancy of the community being sustainable, to your point. It's like, if there's no business model that you can put on top of it, whether it's services, whether it's consulting, whether it's, productization, all of those pieces,
Then it's a hobby.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Then we all feel good about it. But, 6 months from now, they lose, there's a potential that you could lose interest. So, I think that's another sort of evaluation criteria that just occurred to me.
So today, if I wanted to build a best-of-breed solution as an architect, should I look to open source first, or should I look to commercial first? Because it looks like, there's a niche of open source in pretty much every space now that we've seen grown over the last couple of years. So, should companies stay in proprietary, or if you're looking at best of breed, should we look at jumping into open source right away?
I would say look at your solution first.
Right.
I realize that's probably the obvious answer, but look at your solution architecture, look at your business goals for how you expect your environment, your customers, and your internal landscape to change, and have that really, really well defined prior to engaging any vendor or technology conversations, and then reach out to both. Have the commercial equivalent and the open source partner come in and be really clear. Know how you're doing the evaluation based on your own solution. What we see too many times, and it doesn't matter if it's 2 commercial vendors and 2 open source vendors, everyone has their own way to do it. And so you being clear up front about what you want out of it, to me, is really the key of how you would approach that. It's not, well, I'm going to go, I mean, we see it all the time. Like, I'm going to go open source because it's open source. And then you make famous mistakes like picking a niche vendor that is a hobby. Or you go, well, I'm all in commercial, and then wait a second. When the CMO says, well, there's this new thing that just came out, you're like, well, it's on our vendor's roadmap. They'll get to it when they get to it. And so it's just the awareness of what you want out of it is where I would start, which is the way it's always been. There's actually no change in that answer.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's to torture my Mississippi River Delta maybe even further. I think you really should think about where you are in the time scale of this solution set, right? So is it well established? Are there vibrant, dynamic communities that are going to be able to move faster? Or is this something that's your special sauce that you don't think anybody else can replicate? And you need that level of customization, that level of focus and specificity. Those are the moments, I think, when it's worth looking at something that's more proprietary. But with that mindset that, that stack is going to keep building higher and higher. So you don't want to go invest a lot of energy in building something or implementing something that's proprietary, only to find that it was the next thing that was going to be, sort of broadened out and become much more innovative, and suddenly your solution is outdated, right?
I would actually challenge that just a little bit. I think that, it's less about proprietary. So if we think about commercial solutions, you'll never own the core stack. You'll only own your IP that sits on top of that. When you think about open source and you think about you basically have two options with almost every technology, do I go with the commercial provider who supports the open source stack, in which case I'll still own my IP around the solution, but I may use their cloud or their product to help provide it at scale. But you also have another equivalent, which is if it's open source, it's core to your business, and it's something you want to own full stack without ever contributing it back. I think there's an even stronger case around building your product on open source and basically doing it full stack. Go in with your eyes wide open that you've now are off the community path. You're now off basically the commercialization path to help you support that, but you're actually then in a better position where you're building your core business and the IP that's integrated across that whole stack. And so I think there's a third consideration, and I'm picking on you a little bit. I don't think you meant exactly that, but to me there's still a path for open source when you're looking at, is it a core investment?
Yeah, no, the worst panel is one where everybody agrees, right? No, but I think, I think we're saying something similar, and not to agree with you too much here, but the reality is it should be, depending on where you're trying to, innovate and where you're trying to leverage, right? It's probably a combination. And it's just where? Is it 10% or 90%?
Yeah, and what's the cost that you're willing to put in from a resource and an investment standpoint?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. We're almost out of time. Any questions from the audience?